Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking into something called the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. You might have heard it called the SAV Act. It just passed the U.S. House.
That's right, and it's a pretty big deal in terms of how voter registration could change here in the U.S. Basically, the core idea is that anyone registering would need to show actual documents proving they're a U.S. citizen.
Okay. And we know this has been, something President Trump and House Republicans have been focused on. So what we want to get into today, for everyone listening, is what are the key parts of this SAV Act? And, what could it actually mean for registering to vote? What are the impacts? We're basing this on a recent AP News piece to try and unpack it all. So maybe start with the why. Why this bill? Why now? What's the rationale?
Well, the main line from Republicans is it's about election integrity, protecting the vote. They argue that needing proof of citizenship is crucial to stop non-citizens voting, even though, that's already against federal law. The idea is it'll make people more confident in elections.
Right, and the AP article does mention federal law already bars non-citizens from voting in federal elections. And the penalties are serious, like felony charges, even deportation.
Exactly. Pretty strong deterrents already exist.
So given that, who does this SAVE Act actually affect if it becomes law?
Yeah, that's a key question. Initially, there's a comment from a Republican lawmaker suggesting it wouldn't really touch people already registered. But it seems more complicated. Voting rights groups immediately raised flags. And actually, Representative Chip Roy, who wrote the bill, he acknowledged it could have a wider reach.
Right, because it looks like if you're already registered but you, say, move house, or you change your name, maybe after getting married, or update your registration for any reason, then boom, you'd fall under this and need to show proof of citizenship.
That seems to be the case. It's not just brand new voters.
So it's a gradual thing.
Kind of. Representative Roy talked about it as a sort of transition, moving over time to a purely citizenship-based registration system. So the effects might ripple out rather than hitting everyone at once.
Okay, so if we're talking about the system, what are the documents? What do you actually need to show?
The Act is specific. It lists acceptable documentary proof of United States citizenship. One option is a real ID driver's license, but, and this is key, it has to somehow indicate the applicant is a citizen.
Which is unusual for most driver's licenses, right?
Exactly. We'll come back to that. Other options are a valid U.S. passport, that's pretty clear, or a military ID card, but you also need your military service record showing a U.S. birthplace.
Okay.
Or a valid government photo ID that itself lists your birthplace as being in the U.S. Or, failing that, a government photo ID plus another document, like a certified birth certificate, showing that U.S. birthplace.
Okay, let's pause on that driver's license point. The real ID thing. Most standard licenses, even the real ID compliant ones, they don't list birthplace or citizenship status, do they?
Generally, no. That's the big hurdle. Real ID, that act from 2005, it was about setting minimum security standards. You need your social security number, proof of lawful status. But lawful status can mean you're a citizen or a legal resident, not necessarily the same thing.
Right. That little star, the gold or black one on the real ID, it just means it meets the federal standards, not that the holder is a citizen. And the AP piece points out, legal permanent residents, non-citizens, they can get real IDs too.
Now, there are a few states, exceptions mentioned in the article: Michigan, Minnesota, New York, Vermont, Washington. They apparently offer a specific citizen-only version of real ID. So those particular IDs, maybe they would meet the SAVE Act requirement if they clearly state citizen.
Interesting, but just a handful of states.
Right. And the hope from supporters, like Representative Roy, is that maybe more states will start issuing IDs that specify citizenship.
But that sounds like a pretty big shift, and we're not there now.
Definitely not. And real ID adoption itself has been, slowish. The latest figures from January 2024 showed only about 56% of licenses and state IDs were actually real ID compliant anyway. So relying on real ID for this proof of citizenship seems difficult right now.
Which brings us to maybe the biggest practical issue, accessibility. What about people who just don't have easy access to things like a birth certificate or a passport?
This is a huge concern from voting rights groups. They point out, roughly half the U.S. population doesn't have a current U.S. passport.
Yeah.
Getting a birth certificate, that can be tricky too. Cost, bureaucracy, maybe you were born in another state, or even overseas to military parents. It's not always simple. Or maybe you just lost it over the years.
And the article raised a really specific, common example. women whose name on their birth certificate doesn't match their current ID because they changed their name after marriage. Apparently, this actually caused problems in some local New Hampshire elections recently, where they have their own proof of citizenship rule.
Yeah, you can see how that would happen. Frustrating, right? You're eligible, registered, but suddenly hit this roadblock.
So how does the SAVE Act handle that, does it?
Well, the Republican response highlighted in the article is that the act directs states to set up a process to accept extra documents, like a marriage certificate, to bridge the gap between the birth certificate name and the current ID name. Kind of like what you might do when applying for a passport or real ID already.
Okay, so there's an acknowledgement of the issue, but
Democrats argue the bill is too vague here. They think it should have spelled out how this works, clearly and uniformly, instead of just saying states figure it out, which could lead to, 50 different approaches. Potentially confusing or unfair ones?
Yeah, that patchwork problem sounds plausible. So, okay, let's say you have the documents. How do you actually submit them under this law?
Good question. For people using the standard federal voter registration form by mail, the act says they would have to physically go to their local election office in person to show the proof. In person. By whatever deadline the state sets.
Wow. Okay, that sounds like a barrier right there, especially for people in rural areas.
Exactly. Voting rights groups are very worried about that. If your election office is miles away, no easy transport, that's a significant hurdle just to complete your registration.
What about people with disabilities?
The act does say states need to work with the Election Assistance Commission to provide reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities to show their proof, which is important, but doesn't solve the distance issue for everyone.
And what about states with same-day registration, where you register and vote all at once?
In those states, the voter would need to show their proof of citizenship right there at the polling place, not later than the date of the election, the bill says, for their ballot to count. So you could potentially register, cast a provisional ballot, but if you didn't bring the right documents, your vote might not count later.
And what about things like online registration? Or automatic registration through the DMV?
That's a big unknown, and a worry highlighted in the AP article. Democratic state election officials are concerned these systems, which are often really efficient, might just stop working effectively under this. Because how do you integrate this in-person proof requirement? Even if you register at the DMV, you'd still need to provide citizenship proof somehow. The Election Assistance Commission is supposed to issue guidance on all this implementation stuff. Their role will be pretty critical.
It sounds incredibly complex logistically.
It does. And it circles back to that core tension, right? Election security versus voter access. Republicans insist any instance of non-citizen voting, however rare, damages trust.
And needs to be prevented, is their stance.
Yes, whereas Democrats tend to argue that existing federal law already covers this illegal activity. And the focus should be more on helping states clean their voter rolls effectively using current tools, not adding new barriers for everyone.
Is there much evidence of this non-citizen voting actually happening?
Well, the data suggests it's extremely rare. The AP article mentions that Michigan review again. Over 5.7 million votes cast in 2024. They found just 15 potential cases of non-citizen voting.
15 out of almost 6 million?
15. 13 were referred for possible charges. One person was deceased. One case needed more investigation. Tiny numbers.
And Michigan Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson, she basically said this review confirms it's rare.
Right.
And doesn't justify laws that could block tens of thousands of actual citizens from voting. That's a pretty stark framing.
It really is. It highlights the potential scale mismatch. Trying to solve a very infrequent problem with a measure that could impact a very large number of eligible voters.
So where does the SAVE Act stand now? What happens next?
Okay, so it passed the House. Next stop is the Senate. But its chances there are, let's say, uncertain. The Senate is very closely divided. To pass, it would likely need 60 votes to overcome a filibuster.
Right.
Republicans don't have that many seats.
So it faces a much tougher fight in the Senate. Could stall there.
Very possibly.
Yeah.
It's definitely not a sure thing.
Okay, so let's just recap quickly for everyone listening. The SAVE Act wants proof of citizenship to register to vote. Passed the House, faces hurdles in the Senate. It sparked this big debate. Is it needed? How would it affect current voters? Are the documents accessible? What about practicalities like mail-in or same-day registration?
Exactly. And you have these clear opposing views. Republicans framing it as vital for election integrity. Democrats and voting rights groups worried about eligible citizens being blocked from voting, especially those who might struggle to get the required papers.
So the final thought we want to leave you with is this. Thinking about the actual data we have on non-citizen voting, which seems rare, versus the potential hurdles this SAVE Act could create for potentially millions of Americans, what do you think is the right balance here between making elections secure and making sure every eligible citizen can actually cast their vote? And what sort of unintended consequences could a law like this have, trying to fix a problem that the evidence suggests isn't widespread? Lots to think about there. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.